Introductions. I'm Ben Denham. I'm an artist, and I'm here with my good friend Jason Tuckwell, who I just thought, like, you're really a philosopher of art, aren't you?
I guess so.
I don't know. I was trying to put a label on you because I know you're resistant to that, but but I thought I'd give it a shot.
I think the inner circle of philosophers would be more resistant to my being attributed that title.
Right. Okay. Well, fuck the inner circle of philosophers, I say.
Yes, in the general approximation, there's some sort of theorist of art. There we go.
Well, yeah, but I think like there is a relationship between what you do and what like a philosopher of science does in relation to that discipline. Like there's some kind of maybe equivalence.
Yeah. Look, yeah, indeed. Look. For some time, I attempted to appropriate the title of technician, but that seemed to be more formidable.
Yeah, sure. I can
like to suggest I had some sort of expert grasp of something, and I tried to back away from that.
So. Yeah. So, like, there is a kind of an agenda, I guess.
Yeah, great.
Of sorts. Yeah. One of them is to talk about the French philosopher Gilbert Simondon, whose work you're much more familiar with than I am. I've read this section from his book on the mode of existence of technical objects. I'm sure you've read the whole thing. You've got it there. There it is. It's quite
it's actually, unfortunately, you can't see it very well, but this weird, crazy guy, and I can't remember or team who they were in the US. Publishing house called Univocal produced, you can't see it because my copy is trashed, but produced these beautiful copies. I don't know, it's embossed.
Exactly, you get the right angle.
Yeah, and it's got these, and the paper, you can't see, but the paper is beautiful. There's this beautiful blue.
Oh wow, awesome. chapter section.
Yeah, and even these, it even comes with these little, I managed to keep this clean.
Oh wow!
So these little embossed bookmarky sort of thing.
That's awesome. That's great.
Yeah, it's a beautiful object.
Yep.
And I should have done that thing, I suppose, but I don't know. I guess I don't have enough respect for books not to trash them.
Well, it's more like you probably have, like you see their value in actually being used.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. They're utilitarian values.
Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, we'll have a bit of a chat about a section from that book, and maybe you can give us a little bit more of an overview of what the whole book is on about. And so and then there's two other things. You published this paper, Techniques and Agency, in the Angelaki, the Journal of Theoretical Humanities, last year. So yeah, I guess we can maybe triangulate between the Simondon, that paper, and what I've been doing with synthesizers.
Yeah, it's lots to talk about between those three.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, and I thought, I don't know where to begin. I thought we could, because it's I don't know. Maybe we'll start with Simondon. So, do you want to give us a little bit of background on what you know about the man and that particular book?
Yeah. So this is one part of his sort of doctoral thesis. This sort of in France, they have far more. He's a French philosopher, or I should say where he's from. His French philosopher was writing in the 50s to the 80s, or he died in the early 90s. He's becoming well known at the moment. He was sort of one of those very overlooked philosophers until recently, when he's been, well, I should say in the English-speaking world, when he's been translated. He's part of a very famous pedigree, though, which is part of the reason that there's been a revived interest in him. Deleuze is the obvious connection point, like in so much of our philosophy in the Anglo world since the 90s, or the Anglo-American world, I should say, there, and especially in Australia. Anywhere Deleuze went.
Yeah, he was kind of quite influential for Deleuze.
Yeah, like in a strange way, insofar as Deleuze doesn't speak a lot about him, but when you know his ideas, you see how profoundly influential his ideas were on Deleuze. Deleuze does acknowledge it in some of his earlier texts, and there's a little review of the major work that accompanied this one, which is his sort of magnum opus, Information in the Light of Form and Information. Of interest, perhaps, for lots of people, he's the major work is dedicated to Merleau-Ponty.
Right. Okay. Yep.
I think, did we do some reading of George Canguilhem at one point?
Yeah.
So he's also part of that. Canguilhem was an advisor or something. So he's in that cadre.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, and so what about this book on the mode of existence of technical objects? How do we find our way into this?
Yeah, so the easiest way to find, the first thing I guess to say about Simondon is that he's a very idiosyncratic philosopher, and he has a very particular vocabulary. Like a lot of those guys are sort of forging their own sort of language, I guess, to try and extend thought. This book is primarily concerned with what the title suggests, with the notion of technology. And he has a number of, significant distinctions from the history of thinking technical objects, or certainly the ancient history of thinking technical objects up to this point.
Yeah. So what are some of those? What's some of that language? Because I mean, I can maybe have a bit of a stab at that. But what do you think are some of his key terms?
I guess the most important idea is he wants to rearrange how we conceive. He wants to do a couple of things. First, he wants to claim that there is a genesis of the technical object, or the technical object comes into being of its own accord. That's something that's quite separate from human beings. That's a massive transformation, say, of the Aristotelian to the Heideggerian mode of understanding technology, which is always something two-hand. So it's something that is a sort of efficient cause of human beings. It's always attached to a human operator. And it has no motivation in itself. He does not hold that. The reason he doesn't hold that goes to his metaphysics, because he also thinks that about matter itself, that matter has a dynamic principle in it. But in the case of the technical object, he wants to say that it's not natural, as a parallel development to nature. It's a different sort of mode or phase, or sometimes he'll even say a universe of being that's specific to itself. And the corollary of that is obviously, well, if we don't direct it in the philosophical terms or the ontological terms that are, you find in Heidegger or in Aristotle, I guess, who are the major figures of reference there about technology, is that then you have to rethink what our relationship is to them. And he has a whole bunch of really interesting ways of reconceiving that as a consequence of that move of giving it its own genesis, giving them their own genesis.
Yeah, I guess that's partly what this section that we're reading is kind of one of those ways of rethinking that stuff, right?
Right, and the section, just to be clear, the section that probably going to focus on today is the first two parts of On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, is sort of setting out that foundational work, and in his manner, he loves very long, exhaustive technical descriptions of what he's talking about. He's apparently was a little bit on the Asperger's sort of spectrum, so there's a little bit of that going on.
Yep.
But in the section that we're thinking of today is part 3, where he talks about how his theory of techniques fits in with human knowledge and human existence in general, in terms of, and again, this is a crucial thing. I guess this is what the major work of his is about. His entire interest is in Genesis, how things come into being. So his primary work is about challenging the idea that philosophy's sort of assumption that the individual exists as an entity unto itself, and that rather he suggests or proposes that that's something in itself that needs to be explained. So he seeks to do what he calls to elaborate a philosophy of individuation, in which you can't assume the sort of this axiomatic existence of parts or individuals as constituted wholes. You've got to explain how they come to be. So it's a philosophy of becoming, broadly speaking.
Yeah. So and that maybe goes to, because I mean, I like really in this section there's a kind of foundational shift or something that he's recognizing, which is like where you go from what he calls like magical thinking to this bifurcation, which involves like the technical object and religion. What how do you understand what he means by magical
yeah
because it's not
very
yeah,
look, I mean,
you might think of when you say magical thinking, right?
Yeah. So to be honest, I guess you can probably say why this was the major reason that I selected this as something that might be something of mutual interests about this. I mean, I guess the first thing to note, and it's a good introduction to Simondon, to see the way that there's a very idiosyncratic arrangement there that goes from magical, technology, religion, right? At first, like that seems so off the charts of how you would get to those movements. So the first thing, I guess, that would help to clarify it is, what does he mean? I think he means it in a number of registers. So let's just start with the sort of the obvious register. What is magic? I guess in the famous thing of Arthur C. Clarke's version, it's it's technology. It's any sufficient technology, you don't really understand how it works, sort of thing, right? Yep. So in that sense, magic, even in a child's version of magic has the power for the human will or the human capacity to intervene at distance, without any immediate causal mechanism, right? And he does mean that. He does mean that about the way that this magical system works. Now, at another level, what he's also clearly referring to here are those anthropological studies that happened in the late 19th century, early 20th, in France in particular, where what we're talking, Iliad and why has his name escaped me? There's his name escaped me at the moment. It'll come back to me. Yep. Who spoke specifically about technology, and what he's really talking about are sort of shamanic sorts of, or archaic religions, and archaic worldviews.
Yeah, kind of pre-formalized, probably like the sense that I got from how he was using it is like, prior to the religions of the book, basically.
Yeah, so we could say pagan, in a way. I mean, we can use the term that he uses, which is, and again, this issue with, and that comes up a bit in Simondon, is writing in the 50s. So, the sensitivities around language are really different. And I'm sure you noticed that, his term is primitive.
Yep.
So, that's a really loaded term that, I think that we would be far more careful about using than he does.
Mm-hmm.
In another sense, I sort of want to say that I think that he would want to prolong the sense of it, because he does mean it in a particular way. And one of the ways he means it, and this I think is a crucial thing to make, his version of history it's not a Hegelian sort of history of progression, where you have this sort of, where the present is like, a point that moves through a historical thing, and you've just got this sort of mountainous, historical repository of progress, in a sort of Darwinian sense.
Yep.
Where we're talking about duration here. So the thing that's really crucial about this is that the magical phase that he's talking about, or this primitive mode, exists now, and in many ways is superior to what's followed.
It is really interesting, that aspect of it, because there's no sense in which the magical is a lesser form, and in fact, like and I mean that goes to something that comes up a little bit later in this section that we read. But art becomes this way of kind of bridging these realms that are because both religion and the technical realm are lacking in something that was there in the magical thinking,
right?
So and art becomes a way of maybe accessing something of that, which is to do with, it's, if I'm getting this right, it's to do with the way that the technical separates objects from the world.
And I think, and perhaps the best way into that is in terms that will be broadly familiar to everybody. I mean, the thing that splits the magic, and for anybody who's read anything about shamanism or archaic religions or any sort of indigenous worldview, what he zeroes in on there that I think is broadly in agreement is that what constitutes the magical phase is a mode of unity in which subject and object are not split. Okay, so it's prior to the subject-object division.
Mm-hmm.
And in this sense, that the magical world is unified because the relationship between the human and its milieu is, it's not that there's a distinction, but they're bound together in relations, and the way they're bound together in relations is what he calls in a reticular network. And what he means by that is that there are these special privileged places, or more mathematically, I guess you would say, these singularities that exist, where there's privileged places where there's a special relation of the gestalt between the ground and the figure.
Yep.
And they're together.
Yep.
And what I guess he's trying to say there, or what I guess it shows, is that part of the reason that we struggle so much to understand indigenous cultures or worldviews or shamanic modes on things like that is because we find it very difficult to understand a mode of relation or existence in the world which is not split fundamentally between the human and the earth, or between, civilization and nature, or those things.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what I think is insightful there is that he recognizes quite early on that that's the fundamental obstacle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to put it, I think, and he puts it into, it's a familiar, he wants to allot it into an evolutionary framework that does to some extent make value judgments about that. Mm-hmm. But again, in such a way that he understands value in a very pluralist way.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There's a value to each of the progressions, or the way that reality splits.
Yes.
And again,
Yeah, that's it. That's interesting. And I did want to ask you about that because I think it is interesting that he at various points he says this is a kind of genetic model. And so, what do you understand when he says that? Is it just that kind of evolutionary framing, or does he have something else in mind?
He means genesis in more of a philosophical sense than in a
Yep.
biological sense.
Yep.
Although he has a rigorous engagement with biology.
Mm,
As we mentioned before, he's very well aware of Congiem and biological models and evolutionary models.
mm,
He's critical of them in certain ways, but what he means there is it's what he's really pointing there to is he's aligning his philosophy with those philosophies of becoming,
mhm.
and particularly with certain pre-Socratic notions of becoming, in which uh, being has to be, and if you want to understand being or ontology, you have to understand it through becoming.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, because it is interesting because at a certain point he's talking about that in relation to that bifurcation of religion and the kind of technical technical objects,
Mm.
and it kind of has this sense of maybe kind of some evolutionary dynamic because he's like, oh, maybe we can be tempted to think that these things become separate species, but
Yeah.
actually then he's like, oh no, they're not really because they're kind of the same, different size of the same thing, or
It's partly that, and it's also because he's and what I think is heading towards your work and your interest in synthesis. It's really important to note for him that his notion of causality is not linear. So, and it's certainly not, I guess, maybe you could say emanative, or it doesn't begin with nature at a point and then sort of go on from there. He has a profoundly, like, he makes Lamarck look very uh, conservative
Mhm.
in his notion of a radical circular causality. And that circular causality is because for him, he's very critical of the Aristotelian notion of essential forms,
Mhm.
and he proposes a very sort of very creative response to that, where he says that there's no form inscribed in matter. Form is rather information to inform,
Mm.
and it comes from the thing created.
Yeah.
So I'm in a process of genesis. I'm being, if you like, I won't use Simondon's terms because they're too many neologisms, but
Mhm.
I come into being through nature, and then I have a power to shape what I am in my becoming.
Yep. Yeah.
And that's what he would say is information, and he calls that, and I'm not sure, he ends up in a very interesting way defining art in this way. He uses this term and he says art is transductive, and what he means by that is that art is produced by, one, it's constituted by its attempt to try to unify all of these different modes of thought that come from technology or techniques and come from religion. But it's transductive in the sense that it gives to that process a new direction. It's self-directing.
Mm-hmm.
And so and he thinks that, and when I mean radical about that, he thinks matter does that.
Yeah. Right, which kind of dovetails in with the arguments that you're making in that paper, right?
Right.
Yeah, and like, but he's saying matter does that, like, as in, I mean, I guess that, we can kind of think about that also in relation to like dissipative structure, order emerging out of certain configurations of matter. Um, that they produce these structures that are able to dissipate energy, like as in cyclones and eddies in whirlpools in streams and so on.
Yeah.
And then that relationship, obviously, to biology, which is kind of where you're focused a little bit more in the paper, is like what happens when you have a biological system that is capable of sensing and responding to the world, and how it can kind of feed into how where agency exists within that.
Yeah, and I think that's the fundamental thing, where agency exists in that. I mean, it's an open question, not only for myself, but in the reception of Simondon, the way he conceives that. It's not easy to pinhole exactly how he's doing it. It's partly a result of the sort of style of his thought. I think it's also partly a result of what he thinks philosophy's vocation is. The point that you were talking about before, if the magical phase is the first phase of how we form a unity with our surroundings that create a world, and aesthetics is the failed first analog or attempt to reconstitute that unity. Philosophy's task is to do it properly. In a situation for those of us who are interested in philosophy but not necessarily philosophers, in the way that they situate the arts is one of the less creative or original aspects of Simondon. One always finds that philosophy has a conditioning or a normative role to play in regulating what art is supposed to be and how we could think about it. But he does that as well.
Yep. And also like well, it's like the privileging of your own knowledge.
It's a coincidence, Ben.
That's a coincidence. My knowledge is the one that's going to do for humanity what art couldn't do.
But in a sense, to give him more credit about that, there is something. One of the difficulties of reading his texts is that they sort of have this. They either have a very aphoristic quality where he says he's making a statement about an entire sort of branch of philosophy or a whole sort of mode of engagement of thinking about a particular sort of aporia or relationship between particular things. It's sort of historically held, and people sort of have these antagonistic relations about, and what he seems to think that the true vocation of philosophy is to unify all of those positions. Now, that's just my interpretation of that. Like, there are many more specialist people than I on Simondon, but sometimes when I read him, because he'll say some pretty unsubstantiated and quite bizarre sounding sort of things, like he'll put things together that you sort of like people usually take a side on that, or then they have all this reasoning for it, and they'll sort of have these long sort of epistemological, these chains of reasoning about that, and he'll just sort of say, well, the problem is that they're the same sort of. This is one of the examples of the bifurcation of these things that have been rendered incompatible. And one of the things that Deleuze suggested about, and I think Deleuze suggested something similar about his philosophy, in a sense that it's sort of a very ambitious sort of reworking of some of the ways that Kant tried to resolve metaphysical aporias by saying, it's just because they're sort of two versions of the same problem. So hence their incompatibility. And he sort of seeks that mode from where they've emerged. And if I haven't explained that too badly, I think you can see there why he's privileging the primitive mode where there's a prior unity. That's the model. That's where the model for the harmony is, but it has a peculiar sort of, does that long way around to say, does he privilege some sort of way that solution is already inscribed in the basis of the problem? To me, too much. I would say in my reading of Deleuze perhaps suggests too much. He sort of in the short review that he wrote of the major work, he says something like, "Is there a sort of a doxa or a moralistic version in the sense of?" I don't know if you noticed it in art. You know how he's talking about the good and in aesthetics. It's all about the good, and it's sort of like
the beautiful.
And the beautiful.
Yeah.
There's something. He says a lot of things that aren't that, and that I think are really wonderful. But that emphasis on that, and it seems quite inevitable when the avatar of that turns out to be the romantics. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
So there's something there in the way that there's this sort of there's something there in this vocation, which is to unify, which could be construed as being a bit reductive. Yeah. I mean, for me, I guess, I say that because for me, I guess what I tried to argue in that paper is that, art tries to do quite the opposite to that, which is to problematize and to promulgate difference.
Yeah.
Its job is to diversify, not to.
Yeah. And I think, I think that's interesting as well in relation to, how he draws on, like pre-religion or, what he calls magical thinking, and how he's alluding to all of these, other cultures and cultural experiences, in a kind of way that, like the assumption that you can reach that level of generalizing of that, of that whole sphere is, is itself this kind of unifying gesture, and maybe that's not possible. Maybe that level of unity of analysis. I mean, it is interesting because I think, one of the things that I found really striking is that he's really trying to describe things at a very high level. He's really going for a very high level of abstraction, in terms of how can we look at these really broad tendencies and give an account of them that still actually holds together in some way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is not an easy thing to do, and I
no, and he has a very profound, he makes a profound attempt to do that, I think, in the model. It's also important to say, I think, and I'll just play the other side of what I think about him, because I'm still not entirely convinced one way or the other. It's also really important to understand that what he conceives nature to be. So he talks a lot about one of the problems of the way that we conceive, or especially the Socratic philosophy sort of set us up to think about this stuff. It's that nature is it's complete, or it's some unified. It's either complete in the sense of that it's a set of defined rules, or it's complete in the sense that it's unified in itself. Now, to me, one of his most important ideas is to say nature is not like that, and that nature is what he calls metastable. And nature, or a better formulation, if a bit more enigmatic, he says nature is in excess of itself.
Yeah.
So this idea that nature has this pluralist thing. It's not a substance. It's not one. It's a series of tensions that cannot be resolved in itself.
Yeah.
So the emphasis upon unity is another way to view that is precisely it's a task that we have to undertake in order to make a world.
Yeah.
Because nature can't make a world on its own. So that's our task.
Yeah, and maybe it's a human. It's a human endeavor, right? It's like it's a kind of necessary human endeavor to try and figure out how all of this stuff fits together.
And insofar as that is a way to formulate, say, the problem of autopoiesis, and I think that's very compelling. And I think in that sense, that's precisely, well, that, leaving aside the sort of that metaphysical baggage that wants to just think about autopoiesis in terms of parts and wholes and what comes first in the sort of chicken and egg problem, I think that's a very elegant way to talk about how this is this sort of Simondonian thing where the emergent thing, Genesis, the drive, which also has to talk about why it evolves, comes from the fact that this is this sort of it's a binding between the necessity of both. One makes the other necessary. So because you have this foundational nature that doesn't have this property in itself, what drives the emergence of an individual, whether it be an individual particle out of a quantum state, or whether it be the emergence of living or of the psychic, from a living body, it all has this pattern that is trying to unify these elements that become disparate and can't be unified in themselves and require a higher dimension in order to, or a new order of abstraction or a new mode of or phase of being in order to resolve. And insofar as that's clearly what he's intending, I think it's a really compelling metaphysics in that sense. And it's really, really consistent with contemporary science. I mean, he is rigorously engaged with science.
Yeah, absolutely. It is consistent with from what I have read of contemporary biology, and the idea of these kind of succession of metastable states, like that nature is this kind of succession of metastable states. And there's a bit that I've got the PDF here open on my other screen, and it's there's this bit that I've got highlighted. The successive stages of an individuating structuration, going from metastable state to metastable state by means of successive inventions of structures.
Yeah.
Right? Which is, I mean, that's some deep shit. You know what I mean? That's really profound if you think about it in terms of like the invention of structures, like that maps really well onto understandings of biology and understandings of biological complexity.
Absolutely.
And the way that and all of that stuff around, like these metastable states, because like nothing can be, there can't be this kind of fixed natural order, because that's obviously evolution has taught us that, but evolution also has these kind of crazy phase shifts where something really profound happens in the evolution of an organism, and it can change the whole system. The whole planetary system can change. Based on one innovation at the level of the organism.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and as we know, that this is Lamarck's fundamental insight. There has to be an explanation for why evolution isn't a smooth gradient.
There are these jumps. Right? And even picked up on this as well. He had this whole kind of punctuated, I think it's punctuated equilibrium, where he's talking about how there's these periods in the fossil record of very little change. And then something happens and a whole lot of shit changes.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So in that sense, and what I guess, and Simondon around that point, I think that you highlighted, and that's a great quote. He really makes sure that he reaffirms there that the problem is that you can't start from an equilibrium state. This is a classic Socratic problem, I guess, or certainly the Aristotelian problem. You've got homeostasis is sort of characterized as the sort of the mode of the universe. This reappears in Gestalt. That he speaks of really favorably, because Gestalt tries to think about the relationship between the subject and the object, or the figure in the ground prior to its separation, and tries to think about the way that there are things and events and gestures and movements and things that happen that don't belong to what can't be understood as belonging to one or the other. Things like intentionality and all of those classical problems. How does your mind point to an object? It breaks people's brains. Like it breaks people's brains, and it's like, Simondon would say something really obvious, but like simple about that is just like, the problem is that you've bifurcated the reality into these two separate states, and the relation is not going on there. It's something like, and in a way, and it will be very unsatisfying to a lot of people who've worked very hard to do that, because it's sort of, I guess, something almost like a reverse autopoiesis. There's a prior state of unity there. So this notion of, and what he's saying there, there are successions, and structure is not universal, right? There's like, and he's got a number of targets there, but one of them certainly is that sort of, a lot of that contemporary thought at the time from structuralism, whatever, that there's a universal structure.
Yeah.
Whether it happens in the order of language, or whether it happens in the order of sense, or whether it happens in the order of signification, or whatever it is. I mean, he absolutely does not think that. He sees that is subsumed in metastability.
Yeah.
And it's a powerful idea. He's got a powerful response to that.
Yeah.
And by the way, I mean, I think one of the things I find the most impressive about that, I haven't read a lot, but I've always been very impressed by, Stuart Kaufman, and his problem is, well, we've got this really embarrassing problem in our sort of scientific understanding of the formation of life. Whatever, we just got no idea how you can get from, inorganic to organic life.
Yep. Right.
And like, no one's got any idea. How Simondon describes it, if you accept the notion that nature it begins with metastability, then Simondon can tell you exactly how that happens.
So what's Simondon's explanation?
It's the emergence of a different state of genesis that follows the same pattern.
Right.
So you have, in the same way, he talks about the example of the crystal in inorganic chemistry there. You've got this crystal grows because it has a little seed, and it has no interiority, right? Like it just it grows at its edge, and and it doesn't have a prearranged pattern. It just follows the sort of contingency of whatever the seed that gives it its shape, and it lives on its edge, he would say, and it sort of grows and that's a notion of a mode of individuation that has no priority in any particular thing. It's this it's the tension of the liquid at a certain supersaturated state, and then you get the little seed, and then off it goes.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think that those to me are the most, like, there's all this hand wringing about like how do you get the ribosome? How do you get like RNA? How do you get this complex thing that's able to reproduce itself? And like the metaphors around like in order to do this by chance, it'd be like a cyclone going through a rubbish tip, and suddenly a 747 plane pops out the other end. And
right.
It's like, but clearly, like, if we're not thinking about chance here. There are kind of physical properties of matter that we can. That there is these organization of structures in matter itself, and to me they're the most compelling arguments around the genesis of life, is that matter tends towards organizing itself.
Right. That correct. And what I guess Simondon would say is that it organizes itself insofar as it is matter, but you can't. That doesn't give you the sufficient conditions for how life has to organize itself. What has to happen is that you get, and this is where the conceptual apparatus of metastability works well in his favor is that what happens is that the crystal is an attempt to organize and to resolve the tensions, the prior tensions in the state. And then it does its thing, and that constitutes its mode of becoming and its process of individuation. But then it gets to a point where it starts to bifurcate from this original process, and it produces those bifurcations produce their own tensions, and then those tensions oversaturate, which begins the process again. Then you require a higher level of organization to resolve those tensions. And that next phase, so the reason you don't have the problem of the cyclone and the rubbish is because the only causes that are admitted there are laws of nature and contingency. There is another order in play here, which is the fluctuation between, between tensions and the resolution of tensions.
Yeah.
And so that accounts for the demand of unity.
Yeah. And that's metastability, right? Is
correct.
That's what it is like on a chemical level, like these dissipative structures in chemical reactions, where they will oscillate back and forth between these two states. Is that there's this oscillation that is like far from thermodynamic equilibrium. They're doing that oscillating thing out a good distance out away from entropy, and that oscillating thing, that is metastable, and it can produce other things because it's not really close to heat death. It's already removed. It's already like energetically a bit out there. In terms of,
and you get an important thing, I guess, for him is that these happen again. This idea that we're talking about individuation happens in a duration. It's not historical succession. So it's not like the physical process exhausts itself and then it passes over into the living. The process going on in the process that governs, the nature of the physical continues to govern the nature of the physical and continues to play itself out whilst calling into being a higher organization or unity. And then once that happens, because part of that being, and this is the part where, for classical metaphysics, people would be very unhappy with you for saying such a thing. Like, it's you've got a different set of laws that govern that.
Yep.
Like that emerge with that it brings into being in its becoming.
Yeah.
So you've got orders of laws that pertain to the different strata.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about stromatolites as a kind of an example of that, because they're like these fascinating structures, right? Talking about structures and talking about metastable structures. These are structures that have existed for pretty much as long as life on Earth has existed. Like around, I think some of the oldest stromatolites in the fossil record are around 4 billion years old, 3.7 billion years old.
Yep.
And like they are like a organizing structuring principle for life, because you have like once you have like a photosynthesizing bacteria, right, that lives in the surface layers of the stromatolite, they produce, part of their metabolism produces like this kind of sticky gooey stuff that then accretes grains of sand into it. And so you get these kind of layers in this kind of structured, layered kind of perforated kind of system, and it builds up over time. And then you have that kind of facilitates other varieties of cyanobacteria that are able to photosynthesize at much lower light levels to develop in that strata. So there's light penetrating into the strata, and you have these other photosynthetic organisms that are evolving and developing, and then you have all of these other organisms that are coming in and working with the byproducts of like the photosynthetic process, everything that the cells are excreting. And because they're being excreted into this structure, into the stromatolite structure, they're not just being immediately diluted into the ocean, they're actually at very high concentrations. And so you have this cycling of nutrients and energy that's going on within this kind of cosmopolitan stromatolite kind of community that then produces this incredible diversity, because there's all of these gradients that are being contained within the structure of the stromatolite. There's gradients of light, there's gradients of all of these different chemicals, and you have bacterial species that are able to adapt to all of these different points along those gradients, and find a way to live within this kind of cosmopolitan structure. And so like just and like I think I thought of I think of that example in relation to what you were saying, because it points to the fact that like you've got these physical laws which are to do with like the movements of tides, and the way that certain materials can aggregate. Like these are kind of physical properties of those materials, like the sand, like the sand in the ocean has a coarseness that will allow it to aggregate in a certain way, and so on. So you're dealing with like that's one layer of that creates this very complex community, is actually the physical layer, right? And
Absolutely.
then on top of that, you've got all of these metabolic processes that cause all of these other layers of kind of activity to evolve. So and you end up with this incredibly complex, diverse community that is, there's still stromatolites over in Shark Bay in Western Australia.
Yeah, that's right.
3.7 billion years these communities have lived on this planet. That's freaking amazing.
Yeah.
Evolutionary turn.
Yeah, it's really mind-blowing.
Yeah, if we think of that, and I think you can think of that as a kind of organism in itself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
If we think of the stromatolite as an organism, then they're the oldest, organism on the planet. They're like the oldest kind of multicellular kind of organism on the planet. You know what I mean? Like,
they're planetary scale or planetary duration.
Yeah, planetary duration, and also, because they were so widespread at a certain point in our history, they likely contributed significantly to the oxygenation, the Great Oxygenation Event, right? So
yeah, that's right.
So there's this structure that then has this kind of planetary effects in terms of oxygenating the atmosphere. And
That's right.
yeah, I mean, amazing, like just amazing, like how you go from this kind of physical kind of these kind of physical properties to like these structures, these interactions between organisms, and how they can continue through time.
Yeah, it's for his part, Simondon actually undertakes quite a specific analysis, not of the stromatolites, but of coral.
Yeah.
And he raises very similar questions to you're talking about, and in fact undertakes a very slow but quite vertiginous sort of deconstruction of the notions of things like species and genus, which are just so absolutely inadequate to deal with those questions.
They are, and they are, aren't they? And it goes to like Simondon's analysis, really, doesn't it? Because what he's, in terms of how he's defining the technical, the way that the technical is this kind of breaking up of things into elements and components, and how that doesn't, what that does in terms of our perception of larger unities.
Yeah, absolutely. There are things that are there are things I sort of there's a cost to the way that he does that sometimes. So I'll just talk about one example. Sometimes in his development of these notions, I guess we should explain what that is, because we sort of went back to talking about nature from there. So what he says is that after you have this magical unity of the world in which there's no clear distinction between the human subject and its milieu, that recognition or that an event happens where there's he calls it a phase shift, doesn't really matter what he says, but he says that there's this fundamental division in which we become subjects and we change our relationship to our world, and the world splits in half, and we realize that we aren't part of our environment, if you like, in that sense. And so that there's the profound division between subject and object comes into existence. And he tells us that if you want to understand what technology is, you have to understand that technology begins with this split. Mm-hmm. And split into figure and ground. Mm. Now, because Simondon thinks that these, even though there's a split, that they have the same problematic, right? Mm-hmm. So the unity of the magical world is still there. It's still there, but from the point of view of a subject or an object, or from their perspective, they can no longer resolve it between the two of them. So this is going to call into necessity a third thing in that pattern we were talking about before. Mm. It's going to have to call forth another order in order to get them to unify, because they can't do it on their own. Okay, they become oppositional. Mm. And these two things, he says, we said before, sort of in a surprising way, is techniques, or the beginning of the technical object, and of religion. Mm. And this arises out of this revelation from Gestalt, where, and again, this seems very counterintuitive, right? I don't know if you thought that. Mm. It seems very counterintuitive because the technique, it's obvious what is intuitive is obviously technology moves in the direction of the object, of course, and religion valorizes the subject. Nothing weird about that. Mm. But what's weird about it is that technology takes on the quality of the figure. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the object has got the aspect of the figural, mm-hmm. which we would, I don't know about you, intuitively you would think that that would be on the side of the subject, mm-hmm. right? But he says it's on the side of religion. Mm. Okay, so it's the ground. So mm-hmm. religion and the subject occupies the relation of the ground. Now, I think you can make some sense out of that if you understand that what he thinks that's happening is you get somewhat a bit like yin and yang, perhaps. You know, you get these pairings of contraries. Yep. So within the technical one, it still has a relation to religion and to figure and ground through the original problematic, the original unified way of the world, the magical view of the world that's been broken. But it also has some sort of internal tension with it in itself. So the technical object takes on the aspects of the figurative. What does he mean by that? It takes on the capacity to do things, to act. Yep. At the same time as religion forms by universalizing. So you get this opposition between the particular technical object and its a series of discrete things that no longer has a clear or determined attachment to the world, but it gains this operative power. Right? You can pick up the technical object and you can make it attached to the world wherever you want, right? It does no longer reticulate, it's no longer attached to a specific space. And at the same time, religion can develop itself by sort of abstracting, he says, and universalizing the ground, i.e., the human subject is subsumed in this greater theory of God or the priest or something, which speaks on behalf of the universe or the whole.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the fact that, you know, religion isn't necessarily located or confined to any geography, right?
Correct.
It becomes portable. You know, you can evangelize. You know, like the fact that you can evangelize. Like, I think it's
right, and I think it's almost in a sense hubristic. Like it claims all of the ground. Like it immediately claims it all. So not only is it just sort of transportable, it's universal. So it's everywhere.
Yep.
So, you know, and hence it's he's according here with something that we all know, you know, in monotheistic religion, he's talking about specifically here, I would suggest, in
Yep.
it's sort of this that we were talking about before, you know, partly you would think that the sort of that the pagan sort of thing is not incorporated here as much or something, but or certainly any notion of sort of an eternity, or any sort of, all of those notions come out of this functionalization of ground when it becomes abstracted. In effect, it has, and this is part of that, I think what he wants to say is the basic problem of technology. The effect it has is it subordinates individual humans to this expanse. So you're always just less.
Yep. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And the only thing
because
you have
Yeah, because you no longer have that relationship to, you know, these sacred places or these, you know, particular grounded connections to the whole, which allows you to experience, you know, unity or whatever, right?
Right.
You're dislocated from that. So you're always less than that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's easy, in a sense, I guess, to understand how you can achieve an experience of unity with the world and yourself if the world is geographically constrained to special places and ritualistic engagements with those special places, the high ground at the middle of the forest, and you have that relationship. So it's profound, like it's prior to alienation, right? But once you are subsumed in an infinite or eternal universe, you'd like nothing. You know, like there's a profound alienation of that, and it's sort of like the consolation is, you've got a tool to go and chip out a bit of the earth somewhere.
Yeah, or you got your iPhone.
You've got your iPhone, exactly. You know, like that's your consolation.
Yeah. Yeah, which is pretty shit house, isn't it? Really, when you think about
in those contexts,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, but I guess in that context, and I think it is interesting because he kind of outlines it almost in those terms, right? And then that's when he kind of gets to the discussion of art, right?
Right.
And that shifts things a little bit, and we start to think about how, you know, he has this thing of describing how technical objects can have beauty, right? And again,
Yes.
you know, beauty seems to be like the highest criteria for what art can be, you know, in terms of how he's talking about it. But this notion that if you relocate or if you ground a technical object in the earth again, then it can be a beautiful thing. And he gives an example. I think he talks about the lighthouse, right, where you know, like, because it's located on a particular promontory, you know, then it can be beautiful again, right?
Yeah.
Even though it's this technical object, can be beautiful because it's connected to that place, right?
Absolutely.
And you know, I think he talks about the plow as well. Like if it's plowing a particular field, that can be a beautiful thing.
So he loves farmyard technology, man. He's into it.
Yeah. There's like a bit of romanticism of the plow there.
Absolutely. No, it has, you know, these guys are all reading Heidegger, right? So it's got echoes of this sort of, you know, the notion of Gestell and the way that you appropriate, you know, technology appropriates nature and puts it to its own end, but it's got a proper end, which is inscribed in the system, right? And again, here's where I struggle with this a bit. You know, it's a bit like art has this really important function. It's failed function, but it's still important, right? Because we should just say what that is. You know, that this sort of way of a religious mode of existence in the world, and the mode of existence that gives technical objects and tools and things, they cannot be reconciled with each other from either point of view. So they just split our existence, and they amplify the division between subject and object, and all of those things. We can't reconcile the universal and the particular and all of that stuff. They're all consequent of that. And I'm going to be more careful here and not say art. I'm going to say aesthetic thought and aesthetics, because
that's what he says.
Yeah, and he's doing that very intentionally too. Aesthetic thought is the mode in which it's the higher unity, or it's the attempt to reconstitute the magical world. And it tries to do it in precisely the way that you were talking about, right? Like, so what art tries to do is that it tries to restore the reticulated order. So the technical object should be grounded in the earth, a particular time and a place, and then the abstraction of religious ritual needs to be reinserted with the important gestures of human.
Yeah, or again, it's the particular, right? He talks about like religious festivals, you know, like that a religious festival is like grounded in the sense that it's happening at a particular time and place. You know, it's happening in a particular community. You know, they might be dancing through the streets, you know, in a particular way that is specific to that community, and that's what gives it its beauty. Not when it's abstracted from that into this kind of weird universal thing.
Right. You know, and I guess a modern example of that would be sort of, you know, like those sort of religious holidays, and you don't have to be religious to enjoy them, you know, like you just
yeah, I mean, look, I
just take the day off and it's wonderful.
You know? Totally. And Latin Americans are very good at this, you know, like there's certainly like festivals in Mexico where, you know, like the whole point is just to get really drunk and dance in the streets. You know,
it's the same in France, right? You know, all the Catholic, because it's wonderful because the Catholics have so many of them. My God.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. They just kind of multiply. So, and because also there's been, you know, within Catholicism, there's been this kind of, you know, or you know, in particularly in the New World, there's been this kind of adaptation of kind of more pagan, you know, traditions into Catholicism as the means for them to survive and continue.
Indeed.
So it's rich with that stuff. It's still like those significant places are still there. There's you know, you can climb up a particular mountain on a particular day and, you know, give your blessings to the Virgin or whatever, right? And but it's all happening in that, it's all grounded in that specific place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
Mm.
The thing it does do for the work of art, and let's try and separate out here what he means about. So I'll talk about what I think about this, and then I'll return to Simondon. So it's really important, I think, that, and particularly for those of us who sort of situate ourselves more in, and all of us know this, who situate ourselves more in the field of art than we do, say, in the field of philosophy, even though I guess I'm closer to that and to aesthetics, is that I'm always very cautious about aesthetics, because often what you're talking about and what the object of analysis and discussion there has very little to do with art, in my opinion. And I think that is always something that needs to be taken into account very clearly. And Simondon, and this is part of his system here, whilst at times I think he attends very carefully and closely to think about the work of art, and I'll try and use that term just to denote what we would talk about art, is that one of the things, I think he does a number of very good things. One of the things that he does is he talks about how important it is that we don't reduce what happens in art to the object, and you can't understand anything about contemporary art and not have that as a sort of a fundamental premise, right? You know,
and it's even there in the way that he's talking about technical objects as well, right? That they somehow, like, that there are these. I'm blanking a little bit now, but there's a way of thinking about how they're used that is really significant, you know, in terms of how we discuss like what a technical, you know, what that object is, what the significance of that object is, and maybe how it can be grounded as well if we come back to the, you know, the ways that they're used.
That's right. But he, to me, at the expense of sort of articulating what he wants to say about aesthetics, and what I think he wants to say about aesthetics is to prepare, he wants to use aesthetics in a very, you know, within the philosophical tradition, and I'm thinking obviously of Kantian, the way that he arranges this, is that he's preparing aesthetics as the medial ground to get to philosophy. Okay, so he's got this in mind, right? Magic, aesthetics, philosophy, right? So you've got the proper unity, you've got the failed partial unity, which is art, and then you've got aesthetics, and you've got philosophy, which completes the job, right? And the way it completes the job, by the way, is because philosophy understands that the real problem is genesis in itself. So that's what he thinks the difference is, and it's capable of making thought adequate to understand genesis in its actual manifestation, right? So that's why he thinks that. But what he's doing to art by encasing it within the logic of aesthetics that comes out of this second move about philosophy is that he's giving it a vocation, and he's giving it a task, and he's doing it in such a way that he uses it to draw lines about, in a way that I think that he does something to art that Heidegger does to technology. He says, Heidegger's like, there's the good technology and there's the bad technology. I think Heidegger is more sophisticated in this way, because Heidegger would be the first to acknowledge what he's talking about there is techne. He's talking about technique. So what he's talking about is art and technology. But Simondon's system explicitly splits them. So when he's talking about techniques, he is not talking about art or aesthetics, I should say. And he puts a lot of the work of art in with aesthetics and distances it from techniques. And that's an original way to consider it, but he's taking away a lot of the resources that I think are really essential to think about what art does. And one of the things, I mean, to me, I think it seems like a small matter, but yes, hatred of aestheticism. Right. The movement of, I don't know, I was, by coincidence, I've actually been reading Uribe, which is, the novel by Huysman, the aestheticism novel where, like art for art's sake.
Right, okay, yeah.
Right, the sort of, that begins modernism, right? Like it's in my opinion anyway, I mean, sort of modernism takes off after that. And it's just sort of aesthetics for its own sake, right? Yep. So this is like counter everything he's saying that art is supposed to do. It's not trying to unify anything. It's trying to explore itself for itself. And there are a couple of he actually names it here and says, the bad art is aestheticism and the good art is romanticism, right? Right. So, one is you be a good child and you follow what nature is supposed to do and what you're supposed to do for the system, right? And so there's something very normative about that. In the same way that Heidegger says that, that the good art, follows truth. It does what we're supposed to be doing. Yep. The bad art or the bad technology doesn't challenges what we're supposed to do. For me, I would reverse that. The good art challenges what we're supposed to do. I mean, it's part of the system that destabilizes. Yeah. So there can be creative emergence, right? Yeah. And to me, it comes from that, whatever it is that is the sort of the principle of that creative workflow. And that was the thing I was trying to map in going back to not the stromatolites, but to the cyanobacteria in that paper, which is that there's an argument to be made that those things have a artificial technique, that they develop a technique to survive that has repercussions for the order that exists at the time. And then that makes another mode of creative evolution possible. Yeah. And this is pretty conventional stuff about the role that the oxygenation events causes for the emergence of multicellular bodies. That doesn't come from primary nature. It doesn't come from planetary organization, which is why, we haven't had, complex multicellular life come and visit us on Earth yet. Like it doesn't just the nature that produces, planetary accretion doesn't give you multicellular organisms. Maybe it gives you bacteria.
Yeah, that would seem pretty reasonable. That you could probably go out there and find bacteria. But yeah, and there is a significant jump. There are like in that comes back to that kind of metastable equilibrium that we're talking about. That there are these really significant leaps that have to happen. There are these. And one of them is, when it comes to multicellular, this is something that Nick Lane has written books about, is the energetic requirements of a multicellular organism. And you only meet the energetic requirements of a multicellular organism when you have oxygen respiring organisms integrated into the cells of other organisms. Like that's the mitochondria, right?
That's right.
And the
Michaelis's work.
Yeah. The symbiotic origins of the nucleated cell, right? That you have these two bacterial species that come together, and one can make the fuel, and the other one can, I don't know, like that. Maybe that division of labor is too simple, but one makes the fuel certainly. One and then out of that fuel, you can go ahead and build bigger bodies.
That's
you
right.
have all of this excess energy. And Nick Lane talks about that in terms of like that most bacterial cells, like most bacterial species, are actually living right at the edge of what they can do energetically. Like they're right on the edge, and to the extent that there's this thing that happens with genomes, right, where like making the genome is a significant energetic cost to the organism. Actually just getting, remaking that part of themselves is a significant energetic cost, within the organism as a whole. They have to put in all of these resources into just making the genome. And when you look at multicellular creatures, like making the genome is a tiny fraction of the energetic budget of a multicellular organism. It's insignificant, right, in the energetic budget of a multicellular organism. Like it's a tiny fraction, and so then genomes can explode in size. They can get much bigger, and you can have all of this diversity evolving because you've overcome that energetic kind of barrier to multicellular life. So absolutely, there are these kind of moments where something changes in that equilibrium. Something flips over, and you enter into another state, and and then it becomes like, how do you imagine whether you got there, how you could get there again or whatever, because there's all these contingencies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, again, that these are these things that, the real advantage of the proposal sort of, or the sort of metaphysical order or organization or insight that Simondon has, he says some really intelligent things about that. Once you've got the epithelial envelope and, well, the first thing he says is that interiority, and hence why he says about individuals can't be first, because interiority doesn't come first. So what we know now about, what Michaelis's work and all of that stuff has shown, or, the work around the little bubbles around the stromatolites about the beginning of the, the sort of the interior exterior division, is that and Simondon would say that splits the world. Splits the world, like, into an interior. The interior is split off out of the world as a domain.
Yeah, and in a very real material sense.
In a material sense, right? And then once you do that, then you accelerate the distinction between a being that's operating at different orders, okay? Because then you have this temporal thing of the interior, which decouples from the outside.
Yeah.
In terms of metabolism and in
Yeah.
terms of its regulative functions. It's not just sort of, conceptually distinct. It's, it's a regulative and functional distinction becomes reordered.
Yeah, it has its own rhythms, right?
Right.
And to put it kind of crudely, and some of those rhythms are aligned with the fundamental rhythms, like day-night cycles. Like that's like integrated into our cells and the cells of pretty much every creature on the planet, except for the ones that live deep in the soil, right? Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
But like there's those rhythms that are kind of maybe more in common, but then there's all those metabolic processes that are different across all different species. Like what are the fundamental rhythms of any given species? In terms of heart rate, say for example. Like you have these species like blue whales that are capable of having their heart beat 1 time a minute or something like that.
Yeah,
And
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
And then a hummingbird at the other end of the scale, right?
Right, of course.
Where the heart rate is some ridiculous, I don't know what it is, but like you can imagine, like the metabolic rate that's required for a hummingbird is like off the chart. So you've got these completely different kind of rhythms that are operating, like you say, because once you've decoupled, once you've got have that individuation, then you can have these rhythms that are doing their own thing.
That's right. And you still, and again, like you're saying, I mean, you can deviate and you can stretch and you can reconfigure, but you're still restrained by those physical requirements. So, there's this hard determination about the way that energy expenditure works, whether you're a particle or whether you're a living being.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I think, so.
Yep, it comes back to the environment, and I think that's maybe a connection as well to your paper too, because that's something that you're thinking about is the way that like this kind of if we're talking ascribing agency to organisms, is how they come to embody a certain knowledge of their environment, of like what's going on in their environment, in terms of, and like I guess that is there are genetic kind of dimensions to that, right? Which is like techne or something inscribed in the genetic makeup of the organism.
Yeah, well, it perhaps if it is in that sense. So I'll borrow and appropriate one of Simondon's ideas there, that once it emerges, and it emerges, I think, emerges as a synthetic artificial event, and then the organism inscribes it into its becoming, and inscribes it in such a way, in the example we're talking about with the cyanobacteria, inscribes it in such a way that it will be inscribed in all other bodies going forward. And so they will then have a synthetic or an artificial dimension to them.
Yep.
And I guess my interest there, and I should just set it out because, like I have an agenda, like I think Simondon does there.
Yep.
Like it seems to be sort of an unquestioned thing that, or an oft unquestioned thing, that art is something that it's a very anthropomorphic. It just belongs to humans, and it's something of a sort of late or a latter development. And it's, this sort of, and part of it sort of superfluity or something comes from that understanding. And I think because I trace and I follow more a sort of, not like Simondon, a logic where art is far more primitive than that, and something that is primitive in the way that he would describe technology. And there's nothing weird about me saying that. Obviously, that's the origin of word techne in that sense. Art and technique as well as technology, or all those terms. I think that it is an open question of whether it is something where it emerges.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And what I was trying to do in that paper was to use some of these notions and some of Simondon's sort of, I guess, people who are post-Simondon, if you like, Bernard Stiegler and Tuckwell, who've taken Simondon ideas and transformed them in their own ways, to use some of those to sort of try and make an argument that you could claim that even very simple organisms have some version of that. Okay, they don't have tools, obviously.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they have little calculators or something. I'm saying that they're capable of the mechanism that we were talking about before, a capacity to have a sensitive engagement with their environment and to make a determinate choice. And what we're really talking, we haven't really named it, but what we're also talking about here is the big problem of ends, final causation. It's always in the background of these questions about biology. It has been from the beginning, about sort of the ancient ways that you conceive this. What is the end? For what purpose?
Yes.
Does nature have a purpose? And I think that most of us you can't really say nature has a purpose and not end up with theology. So I am with a lot of people, I guess, who would like to avoid that consequence. But I think you cannot get rid of the idea.
It's like because like I can see how you go from purpose to theology, but also like if you're looking at it in terms of like very concrete situated events that are happening in terms of like the life of particular organisms, again, like that kind of grounding thing, that's the level at which purpose operates, surely. It's not operating like at the level of God, like you're a cyanobacteria and it's like, oh, God really wants me to evolve to become a human. So I better do my bit to become a human because humans are the best. Clearly it's not operating
right. So obviously there's that dimension. I think so. The more instructive version, I guess, is if you look at the way that theologists and certain Christian theologists have appropriated evolutionary logic and said that, sure, there's evolution and like the earth is not 6,000 years old and whatever. They're not literalists. They're not stupid people. They're very intelligent people and they're philosophically and theoretically astute. And they say, no, but there's intelligent design. Right? And that there's a guiding principle, right? Because we've talked about the difficulties. What about the gaps? What about the thing? Like one
contingencies.
One solution to that can only be rationally discounted. Can only be discounted on its consistency. There's no way to dispel it. It's just it's a possibility. So there is a overarching or consciousness or thing that's set it up that way.
Yep.
Right. It's as Lacan, as Lacan said, it's being an atheist is much harder than people think. Much harder.
Yeah.
Like that, there's a good reason that the notion of God has appeared in every culture and in very many different guises because it has profound explanatory power.
Right. Yeah. But I guess it's like what notion of God is significant too,
right?
And what kinds of explanations it's trying to pass off.
Correct. And if you want the definitive. Some people would not like me to describe it in this way, but if you want the definitive rational version of that, it's Spinoza.
Right.
Who explains with impeccable logic, much better than I could refute that how that is consistent with a purely materialist, rational universe. And one of the things that he does is just say, well, one, God is not a person.
Mm-hmm.
And most of our sort of misconceptions about God, or we think it's a person, it's not. He would even say it's not even a final cause in nature, but I find that difficult to understand how it doesn't function in that way. But he says that, and many people who are much better Spinozist than I would hold that.
Mm.
But he just simply says it's nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, and all God does is secure the infinite potential of everything that is. That's it.
Just secures the infinite potential of everything that is. That's all.
And it requires a lot to believe that. But if you do believe that, it solves all your metaphysical problems.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like it's sort of you retract them into I can't accept that move, which is why I'm not a Spinozist.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's like, but it's also like it assumes that you want all your metaphysical problems solved. You know what I mean?
Touche.
I don't mind having a few. Like, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, and to me, I think that and for a lot of people, that Spinoza's work is designed to provide an ethics. For me, that sort of sucks the ethical significance of existence for us out of existence, in the sense that we are participating in creating something that hasn't been resolved.
Yes. Yeah. And that comes back to art. And I think if maybe here's my claim about why art is important as a discipline. Inspired by Simondon, my counterclaim. It's one of the things that it does is that it makes us comfortable with the unknown. I think that's one of the things that art does, and one of the great services that it provides to us. If we're thinking about it in a kind of utilitarian way, that it offers us something, it can help us to make it help to make us comfortable with the unknown.
Yeah,
and absolutely. It does that in two ways. It does it because we have these encounters, these profound encounters with art that we can't explain. It's profoundly affects us in some way, and we don't know why or how, right? And we can spend a lot of time trying to figure that shit out, and that's what a lot of critics do, or maybe some of the better critics do that. But also, like in practice, like an experimental practice means you go in not knowing, right? And you're okay with that. You're okay with going into a process without knowing where it's going to take you. And, teaching at art school, to me, that's like one of the big lessons that so many of the students have to learn is like, how can I start doing something without knowing where it might lead me? And also, how can I learn to follow a thread that emerges out of experimentation? Right? And and that's just at some fundamental level, you see the students who really struggle with that, and it's because they just are completely uncomfortable with the unknown. Completely uncomfortable with not knowing. They have to know ahead of time what it's going to be. And and in that sense, and maybe this connects back to Simondon as well, because to me, in that sense, there is something really profound. I think it certainly connects with in mystical traditions. I think the artist mystic is something that many artists have thought about.
Absolutely.
All sorts of different ways. Joseph Beuys, Bruce Nauman has some neon work about the artist mystic kind of thing. There's all I
didn't know about Bruce.
Yeah. But like James Turrell, an artist mystic. I mean, there's any number of artist mystics who you.
Oh man, so many of them.
So many of them.
I saw the Hilma af Klimt the other.
Yeah, well, exactly, right? Yeah, right. So there's clearly this connection between art and mysticism, and that I think speaks to what maybe some of what Simondon is ascribing to art in this piece,
Mm,
which is like its ability to connect back to a unity, to reconstitute something of that was lost when we move beyond magical thinking.
mm,
But maybe and maybe this is me misreading Simondon, but what I would say about art is that it it's always done that. It's always been part of those mystical traditions. It never left that territory, right?
yeah.
It never left the territory that Simondon is saying in terms of that bifurcation of techniques and religion. It's always been there, and it's still there. Like in whatever culture you look at, if you look at song, the role of song in ritual, if you look at the role of pattern in so many different indigenous art forms, weaving and so on,
Mm,
it's right there. It's always been there, and it's never deviated from that. There's even within the Western tradition, there's always been these artist mystics there,
mm,
as well. So it's certainly there in indigenous cultures, and those the sort of the cultures that Simondon talks about in terms of magical thinking. But I
mm.
think it's always, there's a consistency in that thread in terms of Western art as well. So
Absolutely. Yeah, oh
mm,
my gosh. And it's so, arguably precedes it. I mean, it's sort of a strange thing to sort of
mm,
say that that art isn't present in that magical universe.
yeah, that's it exactly. Yeah, and kind of like what you're arguing is that art is probably present in the stromatolite as well, right?
Yeah,
On some level.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
That's right. And I think it's present in the level that, and again, I guess it's partly it's a question of certain, I want to say like a certain nomenclature, I mean, I guess it's partly the way that you formulate concepts of what you mean and the way that you try to, I mean, I guess in the way that Simondon would attempt to do that is by making techniques very primitive. He's trying to say that those aspects of, I guess his response would be something like those aspects that see aesthetic properties there are sort of their anticipations in techniques of something that will become aesthetic or something like that.
Yeah,
To me, I think that's an artifact of, sorry?
proto aesthetics or something.
Correct. Yeah. Or that's right. Or it's calling it forth or something like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, to me, that's an artifact of the way that the stakes of this philosophical problem are set out. I don't think that necessarily attends to me as directly to the problem either of techniques or of art in themselves. And he doesn't want to do that.
Yeah.
He
says some interesting things about both, but at a tangent to this larger project.
Yeah, and one sort of wonders that, and it's one of the things that's interesting about Simondon, one wonders how much the sort of the bifurcation phases are, are they arbitrary to the other things he's saying? Does it really matter if it's, like the general idea about this sort of tendency to begin with a sort of, a metastable system that's sort of in a state of flux between organization and disorganization and tension and resolution. Fine, but like, is it as sort of categorical as the way that he presents it? I mean, does it split in that way? I mean, maybe it splits in, he says it's multiphasic. I mean, maybe it's just more complicated.
Yeah. He's describing one aspect of, like, it's like I said, I think I find it actually kind of quite compelling in terms of his description of that, of a kind of layer, and it's a layer that exists at a level of generality and abstraction, right? It's a description of that layer that exists only at that level of generality and abstraction.
Correct. That's right.
As soon as you do dig down, then you're going to find all sorts of contradictions and
right.
things that don't fit within that schema. But as a description of that layer, it's really compelling.
I agree. Yeah, and just the way that it makes you conceive of how you can arrange these things in such a way as that they don't all have a sort of common basis in a particular sort of ordering principle. I mean, they do, but it's a very, like you said, it's a very deep one. And I guess they're just, there are limits in communication as well. I mean, it's plenty complex enough to try and follow what he's saying, then perhaps he does assume that it's that he's sort of presenting a sort of character-like version of it, but just in order to sort of give you the basic movements he's thinking of. I mean, it could, it just would be incomprehensible if you tried to add multiple layers.
Oh, totally. Yeah. It's kind of like the abstraction of language itself, right? It's dealing with that level, which is kind of also like where, like, you go, okay, if we're kind of thinking about these different knowledge systems, like philosophy has to deal through language. That's its medium, right? And art, has all these other tools at its disposal to maybe try and, communicate something, represent something, like there's all these other modes that, that it can go into. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of stating the obvious, but like if you're thinking about like a more richly textured account, then maybe a synthesizer might be.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, like one thing that I also appreciate about the Simondon thing is that like the importance of analogy, right? That he's talking about as well, and that's something actually as I was reading the first part of it, I was like, oh, this really, what he's describing also has a lot to say about the way that metaphor and analogy maybe works, like that he's describing a kind of conceptual framework for our thinking.
Absolutely.
This is the way that things have bifurcated, and so that bifurcation between religion and and when people like ask you if you believe in God, they're dealing in exactly that bifurcation that Simondon is describing. You know
Absolutely.
what I mean? And when people talk about technology, they're dealing in exactly that bifurcation that Simondon is describing. And when they use mechanistic metaphors, like the brain is like a computer, or the body is like a machine, or whatever, they're dealing in exactly that same bifurcation that Simondon is describing.
I think so too.
Like he is describing something really important in terms of how our thought has evolved in relation to technical artifacts and monotheism, I would say.
Absolutely. And how that responds to sort of just the notion of us having a body and its evolutionary structure and history and all of those things as components of our being. And like he...
Just a sec, I'm just going to shut the door. Just give it a second. That's the pressure cooker going off in the background.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But look, I mean, I think this is a really important point. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, philosophy, yes, it's constrained by the written word. But but that was also open to debate. What's happening there, and somebody like Simondon has got very ambitious ideas about, I think, what's supposed to be happening there.
Yeah,
and one of the things that's supposed to be happening there is this absolute apprehension of the way becoming works for and when he means that, for everything, from the beginning of the universe, what sort of universe it is, and its epistemological consequences. There's a reason that I only go so far when I start with myself and I think about myself and try and figure out my relationship to my telephone, right? Yeah. And part of the problems there, and that he would say, is that you have ignored everything that's led to the phone being there and everything that's led to you being there. And if you want to understand that relation, you've got to start at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's the order in which the analogical operation that he's talking about tries to grasp.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes so far into, what we're talking about before is that that's prior to structure, operations, functions, all of those things. It governs the way that they become one another. And all of this is happening in these transformations that are occurring between different orders that have systems of consistency and rules that are peculiar to them.
Yep.
So it's a bit like sometimes it strikes me a little bit as sort of the way that, category theory tries to resolve the sort of, the various distinctions between different fields of mathematics. It just says, well, it gives it, it's one of the things that comes after, the sort of the failure of the Principia with Russell and Whitehead to sort of find this logical singular basis, and it's just like there isn't one.
Yep.
Right. So
completeness.
So you can't have that. So their solution is, well, you just get them as to their own axiomatic structures, as consistent as you can make them, and then you have these bridges that go between them, and then you have these sets of, for want of a better word, functional analogical transformations of the results of one into the other.
Yeah.
Okay, and so in that sense, it's not. There's some sort of apprehension there of a way that you deal with these sort of fundamental problems, I think, that might be applicable.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think that's hopefully that's kind of the way that, not like different areas, because I think it's like, like that, it comes back to that thing about unity. Like, how do you create a unity? Like, even if it's just like by, like you can't in mathematics, you can't create a unity that is like, here are all of these truths and we can just build, like brick by brick, we can build up a unity in mathematical understanding of the world, or just mathematical understandings in general. And you have to deal with the incompleteness, and so then you have to, okay, can we build some bridges between these kind of realms? And I guess, like if you're thinking about like the incompleteness of knowledge more generally, it's like how, like, and that's, I guess, what Simondon is kind of gesturing towards, is like, how can we build some bridges between these different areas of knowing? And for him it's philosophy, but like there's the like how I would build a bridge as an artist is probably different to how he would build a bridge as a philosopher. I mean, it's certainly something that, I think, like is, and it's what you're doing in that paper as well, is like, how do you relate these different areas of knowledge? Like, what kinds of relations do you set up? What kinds of understandings how can we kind of plug these things into one another, these understandings into one another? Yeah.
My phone just died. I'm back on Wi-Fi.
There you go. Like how can you take these understandings and kind of plug them into one another? And to me, that's that's why, I'm partly my interest in synthesizers is because you have this kind of system which is about like modules, right? And it's interesting in terms of like the technical discussions, but once you start plugging them into one another, and you get them kind of feeding back into one another, they produce something that is emergent, right?
Yes, indeed.
And that's that, and you can hear that happening. It has this very tangible sense of like, oh, if I tune this module in a particular way, it has this kind of instability in it, and the sound is is never quite the same because of those instabilities, and there are these kind of like a little emergent things that are happening around the edges of the oscillation and the way
Yep.
that it's been modulated,
Mm-hmm.
and so you can kind of start to, like, it's a way, like, we're kind of thinking about, like, like diagrams or visual understandings or different forms of understandings of these processes. Like philosophy will understand it in one way, but you can understand certain things by turning on a synthesizer and going,
Absolutely.
how applicable is this as an analogy for
Mm.
all of these other processes that we might be thinking about in terms of emergence, which again is a kind of really big thing, right?
Absolutely.
Mm.
Okay, because again, like I think we would agree with Simondon in this sense that I suspect in whatever way it is that unity is emergent in the Simondonian universe. Okay, like it's not in nature. It can't do it by itself. That's why we're called into being, if you like, in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it's not why, but it's our task because we need it. We need to, like, as an organism, and in the way that somebody like Congiem that they rediscover, and hence this is this thorny problem about finality, or unity is a finality. How do I exist in the even when to the point where we start to challenge these notions of, like, the human species in what sense? Like I'm like a coral outcropping as well. There's some sense in which my individuality can't be assigned to a species because of many types of bacteria I require and the individuality of my particular components and all of that stuff, right? So there's all of those questions. So there's something emergent or synthetic that's required in order to exist. Like it's in a coherence, in my coherence. Which is why my particular interest is in the necessity of what I guess I would call an artificial dimension. Okay, because for me, I think that they're progressive in a sense, and that they're not progressive in the way that we understand, say, the conventional notion of a sort of progressive evolution. That there's sort of there's a thickness or something to the way that those techniques of how to live and to maintain together are contemporary with each other. So, the bacteria that have their own mode of doing that in my stomach, my existence or my art of my, if you accept this thing I'm saying about that unification is synthetic or it's artificial or emergent, i.e., I don't get it from nature. It can't do it for me. I have to invent it. And the bacteria is inventing it, and I'm learning from it, right? Like I'm not in communication so much with its materiality as what it's doing to the food, like its activity.
But there is some communication going on there in your intestine between your intestinal cells and the bacteria. There are these molecular communications that are happening at that level as well.
Absolutely, and it's happening at the level of activity. I mean, there's also there's certainly also interaction that happens at the level of materiality of our bodies and its sort of chemical constituents and the way that it secretes particular things, but those secretions are a product of its attempt to maintain its coherence as a living being, right? So at the level of that, there's this giant, and Simondon has these concepts, he just doesn't apply them in these things, right? So he would say that this is this vast informatic network.
Right.
I think he's totally right.
Yeah.
Okay. And he has really interesting things to say about that and about your project, right? Like, and about, so his discussion of how we come back to where we started. If technical objects have their own evolution, what's our job? Well, our job is to mediate them into a unity.
Yeah.
Because we think about what he said, is that they can't organize a unit. There's a universe of technical objects, but like they're discrete because they're objective. So the task of people is to modulate them and to direct them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we can't direct their genesis, but how they get integrated into culture.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and he says some interesting things about that. He says that we can't really direct them on a personal level, but we have to direct them at the level of the culture.
Yep.
Okay, so he's sort of anticipating all of this stuff about, all about this sort of these ethical problems about artificial intelligence. It's not, and I can't sit there to, and say, Siri, don't. I tried this once, by the way. I said, hey, Siri, are you recording my conversation? And Siri said, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Right. So my individual capacity to affect the technical universe that Apple has built is negligible.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But at the level of culture, that's this, the Silicon Valley culture, that's what's driven the relationship today between humans and machines.
Yep.
Okay, so at that level, it sounds sometimes, it sounds like a sort of reduction of agency into a particular way, but he's anticipating what all of those people like Kate Crawford and, all of those people who are the specialists who are talking about, how we deal with these problems that we're having with the direction of technological development are all saying. It's at the level of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And how it
interacts. The kind of racial, biases that are built into AI, or these types of questions.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And for you as an artist, I think what you do with that is you provide an exemplar of, you show in a sense that what the particular engagement of that is. And whilst there is a negligible effect in the sense that I can influence the culture of my iPhone there, Steve Jobs is an individual that certainly didn't have a negligible effect on the development of the culture. So again, there's this notion that Simondon has of this, the special time and the place and the specific point and whatever, and that could be modeled or modulated around the way to think about artistic practice in that sense. Yep. There's you with your machines. These machines are built to produce sound or music, or to produce a particular sine wave, and you plug them into each other and you fuck with what they're supposed to do and you redirect them to do something else. Right? And you show that that the end that's there doesn't just reside in culture. And I would say that this is a really important distinction about what artists understand and say what cultural theorists understand what art is. The artists understand that there is a role for that individual intervention, and we aren't just structural elements in an organization of units, that actually there is a power in individual autonomy that can interface with that. It's a question of knowing how to do it, I think, in that sense. And, the history, I guess, of, in some sense, the history of sort of, the superstar artist or something, or whatever, is somebody whose work in that regard, in its particularity, has been absorbed into culture.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Like they've made some significant and I think what is interesting in that respect is like that so often if you look at those artists, there are these very humble beginnings to so many of those big artists, and not many of them come from really wealthy families who just bankrolled their production from the beginning, or maybe they did come from wealthy families but they didn't get bankrolled from the beginning. So it's how do you use relatively humble materials in order to create a significant shift in the way that those things are perceived.
Yeah, and look, I don't want to suggest that. Look, I mean, I think there are always exceptions, but I don't want to suggest that the majority of artists who are successful like that that success has come out of their individual manipulation of what they're doing. I mean, I don't think it does most of the time. Most of the time it is due to socio-historical conditions, and it's due to chance, and it's due to those, whatever things, or, those an influential critic who picks up somebody and amplifies them at the right time or whatever, it's those sorts of, there's contingency and chance, whatever there.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and things are overblown and,
Right.
Yeah.
But again, the thing for me, and I think it's worth pointing out and saying that it's worth understanding in itself, if you want to understand what an artist does, like you listen to somebody like you and who's doing it and explaining what they're doing and what they're trying to do and how they do it. And then it's not a question of whether you become like a mega successful artist or you don't.
Mm.
The question is that it gives an insight about something that we are capable of doing and something about the way that the world is organized. And I'm a Simondonian to the extent that I think that what is happening there is has fundamental insight into our mode of being.
Yep.
Right?
Absolutely.
It's not superfluous.
Yeah, no.
Or the extent of its superfluity is also something radically important.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah, it's like that's like, if it is superfluous, it's superfluous in the same way that like the diversity of life on Earth is superfluous.
Right.
Like you have to be pretty fucking like radical reductionist to say that that some of these things are these types of activities are superfluous.
Yeah, and it's a really good analogy. It's a good equivalence. You could sort of say that our superior form of life, we should have just all stayed as cyanobacteria.
Yeah, who needs all these crazy different
more efficient?
Yeah, well, that's it. Exactly, like just converting sunlight into energy.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't worry about anything else.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but I mean, no, definitely it's something that like what you're describing is really important to me. Is like communicating process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like talking about how you like how you talk about experimentation. Like, what is experimentation? What does that mean in an art context? Like trying things when you don't know what the outcome is going to be, and then looking at those outcomes and seeing where that suggests in terms of where you might go next. Like that kind of aspect of experimentation, which is actually a definition that I borrowed from my colleague at NAS, Margaret Roberts. So full credit to her. But just a really nice, simple definition of experimentation. But like communicating like those aspects of process, and communicating as well, like what sense do we make of the things as we're making them? Know, because that's the feedback, like that, and that's where I think art is. We can make this really profound analogy to what's happening inside of a bacterial cell that might be sensing a chemical gradient, right?
Absolutely.
It's sensing that gradient continuously. And it's responding continuously to that chemical gradient, and it's that constant sense of what it's making as it's making it that's allowing it to continue to be and divide and reproduce and all of that other stuff that it needs to do as an organism, right? So that kind of feedback between what we're making and then the sense that we're making of it, and how that kind of drives the process forward, to me, that like that does have this kind of mystical dimension. It does, because it connects. It's mystical in the sense that it connects us with all of these other profound processes that are happening in biology. And it's also mystical in the sense that it produces things that are difficult to account for. Like you can kind of go, oh, there's all of these ingredients that go into making something, and then something else happens. What am I experiencing at that moment when something else happens? As the first kind of viewer or listener to the works that I'm creating, what is that experience of something coming into being?
And I think this is a crucial aspect of it, and the crucial aspect here is that I think what happens in the key, to me, this is approaching a definition. I'll venture one. I know we're not supposed to, but I will anyway. What I think is approaching for me a definition of what you can say about art in that sense is that what you're decoupling is you're decoupling things from their from their contextual purpose,
Mm.
and you don't replace it with a purpose.
Mm. Mm.
You examine it, and what you're doing in that experimentation and in the way that art is intimately engaged with natural processes and with artificial processes in general. Art is not a creation from nothing. It's a decoupling of those operations from their situation and the way that Simondon was suggesting in there, but for its own sake, to see what that creative, by decoupling it from that, you can study or be aware of and to experience the process of creative deviation that's happening in it in itself.
Yeah, for sure.
And then you can apply it to other things.
Yep.
And it can be applied to other things. And I think that that is a specialist discipline to do that. And I think the name of the specialist discipline that does that is art.
Yeah.
And it's difficult because that quickly becomes applied.
Mm-hmm.
So it quickly becomes applied to culture or to aesthetics or to science or to any of those other things that are very close.
Yep.
And so it's actually very, very hard to talk about something like a problem of art in itself. And maybe there's a conundrum there at that point. But I also think it allows you to get in contact with something that's very, primordial in a sense.
Yep.
Because I think that the emergence of that sort of creative deviation is as old as becoming into being, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think, in Simondon's terms, that, that the first thing that becomes, the individuation is different or is already differentiated from what it emerges from, nature, in that sense, because it already is seeking to resolve tensions.
Yeah.
So it's already differentiated in that sense. I guess in my version, I would say something like, maybe I would be a little bit skeptical about this idea that there's this infinite repository that can be brought up with us, which is essentially what Simondon thinks. He thinks we carry around a sort of chunk of this sort of primordial nature, and it drives everything, right? Mm-hmm. I guess I would say that we have to charge ourselves.
Yeah.
And art would be a way of doing that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's like a way of kind of charging, imagination, charging.
Yeah.
Charging up, and yeah, I mean, because I think that the other thought that I just had, and we've been chatting for a while, so I guess we're heading towards wrapping up. But the other thought that I'd had is just in relation to the body, right, and bodies, in this connection, because I think, to me, it's something that I've been thinking about more recently as well, is like, and it's part of one of my motivations in working with sound and synthesizers, and is also related to the embodied experience of sound and what that is in other contexts, and in the context of, maybe unity as well, and maybe it's a kind of bridge, and I think that's how it's functioned in a lot of ritual and ceremonial settings. It's a way of kind of unifying experience, like through song or music or sound, that we're sharing a common experience in a common space, and so then it has this connection to, like, the healing aspects of those rituals as well, like, is that by sharing that common experience, maybe we are able to have some sense of the unity of our, that can exist within our own bodies. We're talking about all different kind of cellular processes, and bacterial cells and whatever that exists within our bodies. But I think in that shamanic kind of tradition, it's kind of part of the healing process is a kind of reunification of all of that stuff that makes you what you are, and that can become a healthy pattern of unity, right? And you become that emergent thing. You are that emergent thing that is the body, like we have bodies, but we are a body, right?
Yes.
And I think we experience, it's interesting that, isn't it? And I guess that's a whole philosophical debate, or discussion around like what constitutes self.
Mm.
But we have bodies and we are bodies, and we can have these kind of mystical type experiences when we perceive that we are a body.
Yeah,
Know what I mean? When we
absolutely.
perceive a kind of unity, and we also perceived maybe a diminished sense of subjectivity within that unity. Like you dial back the ego a little bit, and
Yeah,
then you can
absolutely.
experience a different kind of unity of your being.
That's right.
And
And
that,
it's
yeah. Go ahead.
absolutely, and again, I think as you described very well, I mean the key term there is the distinctions there are emergent, not historically emergent, but emerging.
Mm-hmm.
Consciousness, consciousness doesn't go to sleep when we go to sleep. It doesn't appear because it's not being generated.
Yeah.
It doesn't. It needs the body to be generated.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and in that sense, and so when you dial back, the ego, you're not turning it off. You're redirecting what you are as an emergent thing to be sensitive to other experience.
Yeah.
Right, and
absolutely.
Those things they require constant production.
Yep.
Or generation. And Simondon's sort of insistence on this notion of individuation in that sense is profound on that level, because that's that's what it means.
Yeah.
That you don't just become and you're here and mission accomplished.
Yeah.
You are being individuated by all these processes of which you are participating, and you're individuating yourself.
Yeah.
And so you're never the same, in that sense as well. And it's also very empowering in that sense that we can do that, and
absolutely.
engage with that.
Yeah. And it does run counter, I can see totally how it runs counter to some of those technical tendencies, like our medical system is very much in that technical realm that Simondon describes.
Absolutely.
Like the way that we conceive of medicine in the West is in that realm, and what it leaves out is the agency that we have, in terms of bringing our own being into being, like through those kinds of processes that are I guess there in those more, what Simondon calls the magical thinking, like that.
Yeah, and I think, look, to end, and this will be the last thing I'll say about him, that is one of, I think, the most wonderful things about his system is that he sees a crucial place for everything. And not many thinkers who are like that, who take sides about things and sort of want to disparage a particular thing. I really think that, he calls it this sort of commitment to ecumenism, and he sort of he gives it to art as well, because of course, aesthetics is the trial run for what philosophy's task is in this regard. And it is to find the place where everything fits. So it's sort of, it's a pure affirmation of all the experience that people have had, whether it's spiritual, religious, mystic, scientific, rational, logical, ontological, like you name it, cultural, emotional. Gosh, he's got this huge thing about emotions. Like emotions are fundamentally central to him about the way that we know the world and experience and exist in the world, right? So for him, there's nothing is left out and disparaged. He's trying to find a way to bring all those things into a sort of accord so we can resituate our sort of the way that we understand our existence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And like that's like that's what's so admirable about the project as a whole, because that's kind of what we have to do, right? It's like part of the necessary work, it's like how can we like value all of these different aspects of experience, like from the human to every other living species on the planet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so it's really wonderful for that, and it's sort of worth some of the difficulties of reading it. So there's this thing to read.
Yeah. Like it was funny because there was a point, like I think about halfway through the first chapter in that section, where I was like, oh, and it was I told you I was in the mass vaccination center at Homebush Bay, and I was like, fuck yeah, he's got a point here. And then it also all started to kind of fit into place, because like there's something about like that as a technical kind of apparatus. Like you go into this kind of mass vaccination center, and you do your online booking, and then you get into the queue, and then you go and scan your QR code, and then you get a ticket, and then you line up, and then you're watching the screens to see when your number comes up, and you go to the booth, and they go through all of the questionnaire again. It's like such this crazy kind of technical apparatus of that's been set up around that. I go, okay, I'm having this really profound experience of like technical objects here.
Indeed.
And wait a minute, there's another reality as well,
Absolutely.
There's this other reality that is running parallel to this, which is, I think, partly, in the context of the pandemic, is partly the, like what the virus, what viruses are doing, like what our relationship to these organisms is, and what our relationship to all the other organisms that, that carry these viruses is, like, and the fact that it's a testament to the technical apparatus of humans that this is a global pandemic, right?
Like, as Tuckwell says, that the technological, the technology introduces a sort of amplification of contingency, that is, and that amplification of contingency is like the pharmacon, it's for good and evil, and for good and bad, and in that sense, it's like the cure, but it's the cause. And so it's quite interesting.
Absolutely. Definitely. But yeah, that's great, Jason. I really enjoyed reading Simondon, and once I got over that initial, and I guess that's the thing, isn't it? Like
there's a big hill with Simondon, and once you reach the top, you go, okay, and then it kind of go, all right,
absolutely. Then it kind of cascades, and there's sections there where I was just like highlighting every paragraph. It's like when,
as I say, you get to as you get into it, it's almost it's quite aphoristic. Like it's like a packed into each sentence. There's a lot,
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I've really enjoyed it too. It was great, Ben.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. Really good to chat to you as well.
Yeah, you too.
Yep. Okay.
Take care, and congrats again on the
grant.
The grant. That's fantastic.
Yeah, no, it was really great to and just kind of like, for the work as well, like just kind of like, okay, it's really clear that so I put out a proposal, and someone said, oh yeah, you should do that. So I'm like, oh yeah, I should do that now.
Fantastic. Well, perhaps next time we could do, if you're not over Simondon, there's another bit where he talks about information we were talking about before, and the whole thing of signification and sending signals, and it's sort of based on cybernetics, which has all this sort of synthesis stuff around it. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, cool. Sounds good, man.
So we could just do a little bit, not as much.
Yeah. Sure, cool. Yeah, because it's also something that where like you say, there are bits that really, the aphoristic aspect of it, where you can you really unpack a lot from.
You really can, and you can get so much out of like a paragraph, or like a line. You can just, and a lot of people who are doing secondary writings on Simondon, that's what they're doing. They're just taking like sentences and then unpacking them.
For sure, yeah. Awesome. All right.
Take care. Say hi to Sakura for me.
Will do. Yep. She says hi, by the way.
Okay, we'll talk soon.
Yep. Bye. See you, mate. Bye.